He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't need to prove anything. But with just one question, the entire airport went silent. It happened on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon at Dallas International Airport. Passengers lined up in long queues. Announcements echoed steadily across the vast terminal. A black man dressed in a crisp military uniform stepped into the waiting lounge. He pulled a small suitcase behind him, metals glinting on the left side of his chest. No one knew that just days earlier, he had been on a distant front line, commanding hundreds of soldiers through tense operations. He wasn't trying to draw attention. He just wanted to get home to wrap his arms around the son he had promised to meet at the gate. But things didn't go as expected. A group of security officers moved quickly toward him. There was no polite greeting, no courteous request to see his documents. Instead, there were suspicious glances, a stern tone, and a cold command. "Step aside, sir, you match the description." A soldier ordered to stand aside to have his belongings searched to be questioned under the eyes of dozens of curious and cautious onlookers. He handed over his military ID, but no one seemed interested in looking at it. He tried to stay calm, even as disappointment began to rise within him. Have you ever seen someone treated poorly just because of how they look? Have you ever seen a single prejudiced glance strip someone of their dignity? What happened next was something those airport officers never expected. The man they detained turned out to be their direct superior. And what followed will make you believe that sometimes silence is the loudest voice. If you saw a soldier being held for no reason, would you speak up? Stay until the end, because this ending, no one saw coming. It was a mildly sunny weekend day when the plane from Kuwait touched down on the runway at Dallas. Among the hundreds of passengers hurriedly dragging their luggage, one man walked more slowly than the rest. He was dressed in combat fatigues, his belt neatly fastened, and an old cap folded in his hand. His frame was tall, his shoulders broad, his steps measured not out of pride but from the lifelong discipline of a soldier. That man was Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes. He had just returned from 13 months of duty in a conflict zone where the searing heat of the desert was far less terrifying than the moments he had to make life or death decisions for his fellow soldiers. Out there, he was the commander, the one people respected, the man who, when he entered the tent, made everyone stand at attention and await his orders. But here on American soil, no one stood at attention. Not a single thank you for your service. Not even a glance of appreciation. Only a cold passing look, chilling and filled with suspicion. There was something in that glance that made him pause just for a moment, as if his very presence, a black man in uniform, made some people uneasy rather than reassured. He thought it might just be a fleeting feeling, but when he approached the baggage screening gate, it was confirmed. A young white security officer stared at him. No smile, no polite greeting, just a curt nod and a motion for Darnell to stop. A dry voice followed. "Sir, we need to check you. Random inspection." Darnell didn't object. He was used to following orders, used to compliance. But deep inside, something began to feel off. Because this wasn't the first time. He remembered the previous year returning on leave through Atlanta Airport. The same suspicious look. The same way people glanced at his military ID as if it meant nothing. The same feeling of being a man returning from the most dangerous places on earth, only to be met with silence in the very place that should have felt safest. And that perhaps was the most painful part. When a soldier comes back from the battlefield, he doesn't hope for flowers or banners. What he hopes for is to be seen as human, to be trusted, to be respected, even if only through a look or a quiet thank you. But for Darnell and for far too many black soldiers, the America they fight to protect still isn't ready to see them as heroes. Because sometimes the color of your skin speaks louder than any name tag, rank, or medal on your chest. The lesson here isn't complicated. You can serve your country with all your heart, but if others only see the color of your skin, that heart will always be under suspicion. And then, something Darnell didn't expect happened. Just as he pulled his suitcase past the security gate, a group of guards appeared. Not to welcome him, not to assist. They were there to detain him over a serious suspicion. And that was the moment things began to shift. What happened next you would never see coming. The official reason recorded in the airport report that day was random inspection due to suspicious behavior. But to those who have experienced that feeling, the feeling of being pulled aside just because you don't look like everyone else, the word random sounds more like a polite way of saying prejudice. Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes was asked to stop just as he approached the final security checkpoint. 4 security officers approached him, their eyes not those of professional vigilance, but of a familiar baseless suspicion. He hadn't made any unusual movements. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't sweating. He carried no strange luggage. The only thing that made him stand out was his dark skin and a calm demeanor perhaps unfamiliar to them. "Sir, we've received a report," one of them said. "May I ask what report?" Darnell replied calmly. No one gave a clear answer. Just a quick exchange of glances between the officers. Then they began checking his bag, his wallet, his glasses case, his phone one by one right there in the crowded terminal. Every item placed on the table felt like another cut into the dignity of a soldier who had once commanded an entire regiment. An older passenger nearby leaned toward his wife and muttered, "He looks dangerous. Maybe he's one of those dishonorably discharged ones." Darnell heard it, but he didn't react, because words like those he had heard them before, more than once. And that forces us to ask a question: is this really airport security, or is it a subtle form of racial profiling? Racial profiling, in other words, the act of singling someone out for administrative inspection based on race, is no longer a foreign concept in America. From driving while black, where black drivers are pulled over more often than any other group, to flying while Muslim, where Middle Eastern passengers are detained without cause at airports, this has become an unspoken reality known by all. A telling example is the story of Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, a prominent Arab-American physician who once recalled being held for over an hour at Detroit International Airport simply because his last name was El-Sayed, and he had a suspicious look as described by a TSA officer. No specific behavior, no legitimate cause. All it takes is for you to look like someone on the list. And sadly, that look is often shaped by unconscious bias by what people see on television, read in the news, or simply fear because they do not understand. For Darnell, the inspection didn't last very long, only about 15 minutes. But what hurt him wasn't the time, it was the tone. No one apologized. No one said thank you. No one asked, "Are you okay, sir?" Everything unfolded coldly, as if he were merely a risk to be removed from the flow of people. Nothing more, nothing less. And the lesson he carried from that moment was neither his first, nor would it be his last. When people look at you with suspicion, no document is powerful enough to erase the prejudice they already hold. But the most ironic part hadn't even happened yet. Because just as Darnell was gathering his belongings and preparing to walk away in silence, a sudden radio call came through the security team leader's walkie-talkie. The voice on the other end sounded urgent. "That man you're holding, he's not just a soldier. He's the commanding officer for the regional military police." And at that very moment, the entire atmosphere shifted. Because it turned out the man they had just profiled, just humiliated, was actually their direct superior within the joint coordination system between airport security and the local military police. And the story, it was only beginning. "Step aside, sir." Just 3 words. But when spoken in a crowded terminal loud enough to draw a few turning heads, they can slice through a man's pride like a thin blade. Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes stood there startled, not because he was surprised, but because it was all too familiar. He knew exactly what was about to happen. There had been a time when he was pulled from the boarding line because the system couldn't verify the ticket. He remembered the look in the eyes of a child nearby, not admiration, the kind often shown to someone in uniform, but fear. And today it was happening again, this time in front of dozens of people in a major airport, just moments after returning from the front lines. Darnell stopped walking. He didn't ask questions, didn't argue. He simply pulled his suitcase to the side and stood still. An empty space formed around him. People stepped away as if he were carrying something dangerous. Curious eyes, confused glances, even suspicion. Some whispered. Some shook their heads. No one stepped forward to ask if he was okay. And what left him feeling most hollow was the silence. No voice spoke up. No explanation offered. Everything unfolded as if this were normal. And maybe to many people it truly was. Because society has conditioned them to believe a black man standing alone in an airport, serious-faced and quiet, must be suspicious. Just like the story of a former officer named Marcus Baines, who once shared in a forum that he was stopped because he matched the description of a suspect at Denver Airport. When he asked what the description was, they replied, "Tall black carrying a black duffel bag." Marcus laughed bitterly. That could be half the NFL. Not behavior, not evidence, just a combination of traits he could never change. And the saddest part is Darnell wasn't the only one to go through this. Thousands of black individuals, whether doctors, lawyers, Students or veterans all carry at least one memory like this. A moment of being suspected not for what they did, but simply for being. Darnell stood still without reaction. He let them search his bag. They carefully sifted through each item, his watch, his phone, his shaving kit. One officer picked up his military ID, turned it back and forth, then set it down as though it meant nothing. No one asked about the medals on his chest. No one acknowledged the rank printed boldly on his card. What they saw most likely was only his skin color and a potential threat. And in that space, noisy but somehow still silent, Darnell took a deep breath. He didn't let anger take over. He didn't let the hurt erupt, because somewhere within him, he still held on to the belief that maybe this was just a misunderstanding. But sometimes when misunderstandings repeat over and over, they become a system, a social reflex built on fear and ignorance. You don't have to be guilty to feel shame. Sometimes shame is handed to you by others, and you carry it just to keep the peace. And just when it seemed to be over, when Darnell began gathering his things, preparing to continue in silence, another officer, having just received a radio call, rushed over and whispered something briefly to the supervisor. Just one sentence, but it changed the entire atmosphere in an instant. The security supervisor turned to Darnell again, this time with a different look. The look of someone who had just realized they had made a grave mistake. And what happened next will make you believe that sometimes one man's silence is the echo that makes the whole room stop and listen. When Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes placed his military ID card on the table, a hard plastic card with an embossed seal and the bold words United States Army, he thought at the very least this would be the moment everything stopped. A military officer with over 15 years of service, a man who had once commanded a special forces team during the Fallujah campaign, a man who had never broken the law, never missed a shift, never declined a deployment order. But no one looked at that card. An officer picked it up, glanced briefly, then set it down as if it were nothing more than an expired library card. There were no questions about his unit, no verification, not a single thank you for your service, the kind people usually say when standing near a man in uniform at an airport. Darnell looked up and met the eyes of the officer checking his belongings. In those eyes there was no malice, but there was also no respect, just a mechanical indifference, as if the badge on his chest held no weight, because his skin had already spoken for him. And that left him silent. Throughout his years of service, Darnell had believed that rank and duty were the things that helped rise above personal prejudice. He had seen white soldiers, brown soldiers, black soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder in the trenches. No one asked about religion or background. When bullets flew overhead, everyone was just a comrade. Yet here at home, in a civilian space, his military ID, the very thing that opened base gates and granted him access to Pentagon war rooms, was dismissed like a nameless piece of plastic. It wasn't just an insult. It was a silent declaration. We don't see who you are. We only see what you are. And the difference between those two things is sometimes the line between dignity and injury. Another example came to Darnell's mind in 2021 at Minneapolis Airport. A black female doctor, Dr. Tamara Jenkins, was asked to leave the priority boarding line despite holding a platinum membership card. When she presented her card and ID, the staff glanced at them and said, "This must be someone else's." She didn't yell. She simply asked softly, "Why is it easier for you to believe the card is fake than to believe it's mine?" And that was exactly what Darnell was experiencing. When people hold bias in their minds, evidence doesn't change what they've already chosen not to believe. It's not that they didn't see my badge. It's that they saw something else first and let it cloud everything else after. But life in its strange way always has turning points. And sometimes in a single phone call, everything, the order, the perception, the power can be reversed. Because just a few minutes later, the security team leader received a message from the airport coordination office. The message was a single line. "That's Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes. He's MP commander. Direct contact to base." And that was when the truth began to speak. The silence ended. A quiet shock was about to ripple through the entire terminal. That moment began like a gentle breeze, quiet but strong enough to shake everything. The head of security, the same man who had just rifled through Darnell's belongings as if he were just another nameless traveler, suddenly touched the radio on his shoulder. The voice on the other end came fast, urgent, and unmistakably clear. "Confirm that's Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes. He's Military Police Command, direct contact with Fort Worth Base. Release immediately." The supervisor froze for a second. His eyes shifted back to the military ID card this time, not casually. He read the name, glanced at the rank, then looked up. A flicker of confusion passed over his face, mixed with something that looked like regret. No one spoke for the next few seconds. Only the distant hum of rolling suitcases echoed through the terminal. And then his expression changed. No longer the gaze of authority, but the eyes of someone who had just realized they had gravely disrespected the wrong man. He stepped forward and placed the ID card back into Darnell's hand, using both hands, a simple gesture. But in that moment, it was as if he had bowed. Darnell said nothing. He nodded slightly, his face calm as always. No arrogance, no resentment. Because for him, this wasn't the first time he had seen attitudes change the moment people realized who he was. And that was the saddest part of all. Why did it have to be rank that made people change their tone? Why is someone only shown respect when it comes with a title, a role, a uniform? Darnell once said during a private leadership talk at Fort Worth Base, "Respect should never be reserved for the uniform. It should be offered to the person inside it, regardless of rank." And yet in reality, people often don't see the human being until they recognize the position. A recent example came to mind in 2022 in Chicago. A black man was denied a banking transaction after staff doubted the authenticity of his check. It wasn't until the manager discovered that he was the chief financial officer of a major tech firm that the apologies began to flow. Power sometimes doesn't lie in character, but in how others choose to identify you. And that's a lesson Darnell never wished to teach through silence and presence alone. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands there calm and steady and changes the entire room. After that radio call, the atmosphere at the security checkpoint shifted completely. A few officers stepped back. Those who had been interrogating now tried to appear composed, but their eyes no longer held the same firmness. The supervisor seemed about to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize. But Darnell simply replied gently, "It's all right, I know how this works." Then he pulled his suitcase and walked forward past the murmuring crowd. But one person had stood quietly from the beginning, someone who had witnessed the entire scene, and now stood with tears welling in his eyes. It was a boy around 10 years old wearing a white button-down shirt and holding a hastily written sign, "Welcome home, Dad." And when Darnell's eyes met his son's, it was no longer a security screening. It was a test of dignity, and in the end, only the bond between father and son remained unshaken. In that moment, amid the noise and commotion, the soldier was not welcomed with formality, but with an embrace. A long, firm hug, and then the boy quietly asked, "Why did they stop you, Dad?" And the answer will make you never look at others the same way again. After receiving his military ID card back, Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes didn't show anger. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten to sue, didn't insult anyone, even though he had every right to. He simply stood there for a moment, looked directly into the eyes of the security supervisor, the same man who just minutes earlier had interrogated him in front of a crowd, and asked in a calm, steady voice, "Is this how you treat someone who protects your freedom?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a declaration of rage, just a question, but one so heavy the entire area fell silent. The question wasn't aimed at one person. It pointed to a much deeper fault, not in the security system, but in how society conditions people to think. When a soldier has to ask his own country whether he's still worthy of respect, something has clearly been broken for a long time. That question left the supervisor speechless, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew that any excuse at that moment would ring hollow. Darnell didn't raise his voice because sometimes true strength doesn't come from shouting. It comes from a quiet confidence in knowing who you are. Much like the story of Rosa Parks in 1955. When she was told to give up her seat on a bus just because she was black, she didn't argue. She didn't slam her fists. She simply said, "No." One word, soft-spoken, but it ignited an entire civil rights movement. That kind of silent strength, it forces others to confront their own conscience. Darnell didn't need to defend himself, because in that moment, his question made everyone in the room question themselves. And the most powerful part was how he let silence speak for his pain. He didn't retaliate. He didn't appear weak. He chose a different path, the kind that makes others feel shame, not by pointing fingers, but by holding up a mirror. When you know your worth, you don't need to shout it. Sometimes one quiet question is louder than any accusation. Just then, from across the terminal, his son came running, the boy who had been waiting for nearly an hour without understanding what was happening. He threw his arms around his father, held him tightly as if to protect him from the whole world. And in that moment when the child looked up and softly asked, "Why did they stop you, Dad?" Darnell knelt down, looked into his son's eyes. He knew this answer wasn't just for his boy, it was for an entire generation. And that answer is where we'll go next. A conversation between a father and his son that might just change the way you think about justice, dignity, and what true equality really means. The moment the boy wrapped his arms around his father in the middle of the airport terminal, with no words spoken, just quickened breaths, and a small hand clutching a wrinkled uniform, the entire space seemed to fall still. Some in the crowd began to realize what had just happened. Those who had watched from a distance, those who had secretly recorded on their phones, those who whispered and speculated, now fell silent. Silent not because there was nothing to say, but because they were suddenly confronted with their own thoughts. The shift in the atmosphere didn't come from a whistle or a loudspeaker announcement. It came from the gaze of a child looking at his father with a confused expression as if asking, "Why was my dad, the person I admire most, treated like someone suspicious?" And that unspoken question was what struck at the heart of the entire crowd. An older woman nearby who had earlier looked at Darnell with cautious eyes turned to her husband and whispered, "He's the father. He was just coming home." A young man still holding his phone mid-recording slowly lowered it without pressing upload. No one gave instructions, but the transformation happened in silence. The crowd was no longer a sea of indifferent bystanders. They became witnesses, and then slowly carriers of quiet remorse. Because one hard truth was undeniable, most of them hadn't objected when Darnell was stopped. No one had stepped up to ask why. They had simply watched. And that's how it often happens in real life. Not everyone is cruel, but far too many good people stay silent at the exact moment their voice is needed. In 2019, an incident at New York's airport drew attention when a black woman was denied boarding for inappropriate attire, even though she wore long jeans and a t-shirt. No one in line spoke up for her until she started crying. Only then did another woman step forward and say, "I don't see anything wrong with what she's wearing." But by then it was too late. Silence, even when unintentional, can be complicit in injustice. Neutrality isn't always neutral. Injustice doesn't need loud defenders, it only needs silent bystanders. And in that heavy moment, something else happened. The security officers, now realizing their mistake, began to step back. A few stood up straighter. One even placed his hand over his chest, a gesture that in this context felt like a silent apology. No words were spoken, but everyone could feel it. They had misjudged a man not because of evidence, but because of instinct. And had it not been for that phone call, for that title, for those medals, perhaps everything would have ended in quiet humiliation as it had so many times before. But this time there was a child watching. And when a child sees his father, a good man, being publicly disrespected with no one speaking up, the damage goes beyond the moment. It plants a seed of doubt about justice itself. Darnell knew that, and he knew that if the moment ended here, his son would carry that scar for life. That's why right after holding his son close, he leaned down, gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "You know, I forgive them, but I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen." And from that moment on, Darnell decided to do something he never imagined he would turn that painful experience into a public lesson for everyone. A conversation, no longer just a private one, a message that was about to be sent not to blame, but to inspire change. And that was the beginning of the ending, where dignity, truth, and honor would finally meet. What lingered in the minds of many in that crowd that day wasn't the fact that Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes was released. It was why he was released. Because he was a high-ranking officer, because he had direct contact with a military base, because he was someone important. But what would have happened if he wasn't anyone at all? What if he were just a young soldier, freshly discharged with no title, no name anyone recognized? What if he were simply an ordinary civilian? No uniform, no special ID, just his skin color and his presence. Would he have still been called sir? Who would have answered the verification call then? Would anyone in the crowd have felt any sorrow, or would everything have passed as it so often does? That question forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Honor and recognition often do not stem from character, but from social status. And if that's true, then what happens to those without status? Do they still have a chance at fair treatment? In 2018, in the city of Sacramento, A young black man named Stephon Clark was shot and killed by police in his own backyard. He wasn't armed, he was holding a phone. He wasn't a criminal, wasn't an escapee, had no record. He just had no rank to prove his innocence. There was no phone call from a superior, no response from a special office. Just his name quietly printed in the morning news the next day. And that is what weighed heaviest on Darnell's heart as he looked at his son. Because today he was lucky. He had a rank, he had power, he had connections. But what about tomorrow when his son grows up and steps out into the world like so many other black men who will protect him if he's not considered important? True equality begins not when we respect the powerful, but when we respect the powerless. It shouldn't matter who someone is, what job they have, what title they hold, or what they carry in their wallet. We must learn to see people through a human lens, not through pay grades, medals, or positions. Darnell understood that his experience, though painful, was still a privilege. Because he had the chance to speak. He had the platform to tell his story. And when he spoke, people listened, because he wore a rank. But he didn't tell this story for himself. He told it for those who aren't heard, for those who have no title to protect them, for those who are dismissed not because they were wrong, but simply because they weren't important enough. And from that realization, Darnell made a decision he had never made in his entire career. He wrote a speech not for the military, not for a commemorative event, but for the public. He wanted to bring this story to light, not to condemn, but to awaken. Because sometimes a personal story is the most powerful way to awaken a collective conscience. And what he was about to say in that speech would make the entire country pause and listen. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Hayes is not an exception. It is part of a painfully familiar pattern, where black individuals, even when doing everything right, are still viewed with suspicion before they are ever heard. And the most frightening part is not that it happened. It's that it happens so often it becomes normal in the eyes of many. There is something strange about prejudice. When it happens enough times, people begin to treat it as procedure. No one pauses to ask, why does this keep happening to the same group of people? For example, in 2020 in Alabama, Sergeant Raymond Taylor, a black veteran, was ordered to lie face down on the ground while walking his 6-year-old daughter to get ice cream. The reason he matched the description of a suspect. Even after showing military ID, a veteran license plate, and wearing part of his uniform, the situation only ended when a white woman watching from a distance stepped forward and said, "I know him. He's my neighbor. He's a good man." Only then was he released. No apology, no explanation. Why does it take a credible witness for a black person to be believed as innocent? Another example is Dr. Maya Johnson, a biomedical researcher in Atlanta, who was detained at a supermarket entrance because a clerk suspected her of using a fraudulent credit card. She was wearing a white lab coat with a name tag from Emory Medical Center, but no one bothered to read it. When footage of the incident circulated online, many people commented, there must have been a reason. They wouldn't just stop her for nothing. And that is the essence of this pattern. When you're black, you're expected to prove your innocence, while others are assumed innocent by default. Darnell knew he was just one link in a long chain of similar stories. He was fortunate to be heard, but how many others aren't? How many have walked out of airport stores or police stations, carrying a silent pain they have no name for? When the same injustice repeats across different names, places, and professions, it's not a coincidence. It's a system. That system doesn't only live in laws or policies, it creeps into glances, into reflexes, into how people react before they even think. And if no one speaks up, it will keep happening. That's why Darnell decided that what happened in the airport that day couldn't end with a quiet hug. It needed a message, a voice firm, clear, kind, but not compromising. And that's why he agreed to speak at the city's Veterans Honor Ceremony, not just to talk about valor, but to talk about the dangerous silence so many carry every day. What he said at that ceremony would not be the usual speech. Not a thank you, not a celebration, but a reminder to the entire country. And right now, you're about to hear it. A short speech, but one that might make you pause and ask yourself, if I had been there at that airport, what would I have done? The Veterans Honor Ceremony that day took place at the city's central square. Rows of chairs lined the plaza. The American flag fluttered in the wind, and people gathered. Many of them had read about Darnell's story, but none had heard it from him directly. When he stepped up to the podium dressed in a sharply pressed uniform, the entire square fell silent. Not because he was a high-ranking officer, but because they knew this time he wasn't just speaking for the military. He was speaking for the voiceless and for the stories that had never been told. Darnell didn't say much. He began with the same question he had once asked in that airport. Is this how we treat someone who protects our freedom? He didn't retell every detail. He only spoke about the feeling of standing in your own country in uniform and still feeling like an outsider. The feeling of having to prove your humanity not through your actions, but through your title. Then he paused, looked out at the audience and asked, what if I wasn't a lieutenant colonel? Would you still have listened? That question hung in the air. No one answered, but everyone knew they had to answer it for themselves. Darnell did not blame, he did not accuse, he simply said, we salute uniforms, but let's remember to salute dignity too, because justice means nothing if it only belongs to the powerful. And then something happened that wasn't in the program. From the front row, a group of officers who had been sitting at attention suddenly stood. They turned to face him and raised their hands in salute. Some in the crowd stood with them, not out of protocol but out of feeling, because this time the salute wasn't for a rank, it was for a human being, a voice, a truth. There was no background music, no spotlight, just a gentle breeze, the glow of the setting sun, and one man standing in silence, finally being heard not because of his title, but because of the truth he carried. A few days after the ceremony, Darnell received a handwritten letter. No return address, just one line at the end. I was at the airport that day. I didn't say anything. I'm sorry, I won't stay silent again. And that is why he told his story. Not to seek pity, not to collect apologies, but so that someone, just one person, would not look away next time. Sometimes the loudest salute is choosing to see each other. Truly see. If you've ever witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do, if you've ever stayed quiet because you were afraid to say the wrong thing, if you've ever looked at someone and judged too quickly, then maybe Darnell's story isn't just his. Maybe it's yours, ours. And hopefully the next time we're faced with the choice to glance past or to truly look closer, we'll know what to do. Because sometimes the right look at the right moment is a salute to someone's dignity. If you followed this story all the way to the end, perhaps somewhere along the way, you felt like Darnell misunderstood, overlooked, or simply not seen for who you truly are. And if this story moved you, please don't stay silent. Leave a comment below. It doesn't have to be long. Just one line, I saw it. Because sometimes it only takes one person speaking up for someone else to feel seen. You're also welcome to share a moment when you were misjudged or when you witnessed something unfair but didn't have the chance to speak up. We read every comment, truly. If you believe this story is worth sharing, pass it on. Not to accuse, but to remind each other we can do better, look closer, understand more deeply. And if you'd like to continue this journey with stories like this, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories that may seem small, but have the power to change the way we see the world. This isn't just the story of one soldier. It's the story of dignity and of all of us. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And thank you for still choosing to believe in what is kind.